So my name's Huw Morris. I'm a neurologist. I work at the National Hospital of Neurology, Queen Square in UCL, and I lead the prospect study of PSP in the United Kingdom. So going back to the start of my involvement with the PSP Association, I think I'm going to date that back to about autumn 1996. So I was a research fellow. No, I wasn't. I was a registrar in neurology then in the Middlesex Hospital, working with Andrew Lees, Michael Harrison, and Peter Brown at the Middlesex Hospital. And I was looking for a research position. So I wanted to take time out of my clinical work to do some focused research. Now, Andrew was involved with the PSP Association before that, and they wanted to start to develop a research program in PSP. And he approached me and suggested that there might be an opportunity for some work on the genetics of PSP at that stage. So I wasn't particularly keen. I wasn't particularly keen on this because didn't think that PSP was likely to be much genetics in PSP. But what Andrew said was that part of the project was going to involve going to the Western Pacific, the island of Guam, to research patients with a very similar condition to PSP on Guam. And my response to that was, where do I sign, and when can I start? So the net upshot of that was that I then was appointed as a PSP clinical research fellow. I think I was the first full-time PSP Association funded clinical research fellow. So I started work on this in March 1997. So that was the start of my project under the supervision of Professor Nick Wood and Professor Andrew Lees at the Institute of Neurology in Queen Square. I met Michael Coe first in around February 1997, and I met him in the BBC building where he'd been meeting, perhaps doing an interview about PSP on a radio program. So this would be about February 1997, and immediately I met Michael. I was, taken aback by his energy, his drive, his focus on doing research into this condition, his reflection on how this condition affected his wife, and his intense involvement in trying to take forward both research into this condition and also help in terms of the treatment for patients with PSP. So that was a lot of research programs that might be funded by big funding bodies are kind of quite anonymous in that they're not very much linked into the patients or the charities. But this experience for me when I started was very different because it was very much involved with individual patients and families affected by this condition. And actually through my PhD period, my research period, I had very frequent phone calls, meetings with Michael to kind of update him on what was happening and to keep him abreast of the research. And he was very important really in driving forward what we did and kind of keeping motivation going. So I started research in March 1997, and we started collecting DNA samples from patients with PSP, and I made a number of visits to Guam to study patients with this very similar condition to PSP. The coincidental, or maybe not so coincidental thing was that the neurologist who was working on Guam was John Steele, who'd originally described PSP. So he died last year in 2022, and he'd originally described PSP in Toronto. He had moved then to Hawaii and the Pacific and worked on a number of different Pacific islands and ended up on the island of Guam, where he'd seen that patients had this tau-related neurodegenerative condition that was very, very similar to PSP. And so there's this kind of link between this rare condition that occurred out in the Pacific and PSP that was, very much under-recognized then as a neurological condition in the UK, but also involved tau deposition. So we collected DNA samples. I met then in 1997 with John Hardy, who was based in Florida, a geneticist who'd worked on Alzheimer's, but was also interested in families with neurodegeneration that was very similar to PSP, as well as this Guam condition. So this sort of started, collaboration with John on tau-related conditions, which has continued to the current day. A sort of breakthrough in terms of sort of major sort of breakthroughs and milestones in research. A massive breakthrough was made in 1998 by Mike Hutton, working in John Hardy's group, identifying spelling mistakes, mutations in the tau gene that caused a very similar condition to PSP, which is called frontotemporal dementia. So that was a major breakthrough, showing for the first time that changes in the tau gene could lead directly to a condition that very closely resembled PSP. We were involved in studying some of the early families with mutations in that gene, and we published a few papers following on from the initial discovery. Some of those families that we studied had been diagnosed clinically as having PSP, but actually carried this very rare spelling mistake in the tau gene. So I think this was a really important sort of milestone for PSP research, because it led on to the development of lots of animal models and lots of cell models that were used to develop new treatments, which eventually ended up in clinical trials for patients with PSP. So that discovery, which I was not directly involved with, but secondarily involved with in the late 1990s, was a really important milestone for PSP research. The other thing that we discovered then, again in collaboration with a series of other investigators, was that common variation in the tau gene increased the risk of PSP. So this is not rare spelling mistakes, but this is just common variation that everybody has, that actually was more common in patients with PSP than people without PSP. So this was a risk factor that was identified, and those were sort of the major components of my thesis, my PhD thesis. So I was really fortunate to have funding from the PSP Association to start this, and of course this gave me a salary, and it gave me the ability to do lab work, but it also connected me to patients and families. So the PSP Association was able to help me to connect with patients and families with this condition, who, I mean, almost all of the patients that we've met with over the years have been absolutely delighted to help with research and to contribute to research, even though they know that this may not help them directly. And that's something which has been really important in terms of driving forward PSP research, the involvement of the charity and the involvement of patients and families. So based on the initial work that I did, I was able to write an application for the Medical Research Council. So they gave me a grant in 1998, which then started in 1999. So based on the sort of initial funding from the PSP Association, we were able to carry forward this research with funding from the Medical Research Council, which obviously, increase the amount of money and the amount of resources that was available for PSP research. So then in 1993, in 2003, I moved from London to Cardiff. So I spent 10 years working in Cardiff, and one of the things that I did when I arrived there was to obviously start up my own research group, particularly doing research into the genetics of Parkinson's disease and PSP. And we set up a PSP clinic in the Royal Gwent Hospital in Newport that was focused on assessing and treating patients with PSP. That was supported by the PSP Association, and Maggie Rose initially came to the clinic as a PSP nurse specialist, and then Jill Lyons later on came to the clinic to help me in seeing PSP patients and helping to manage their problems. And when I left Cardiff in 2013, I'm delighted to say that my friend and colleague in Cardiff, Alistair Church, or Newport, Alistair Church, carried on the clinic. So that's continued to be a clinic for patients with PSP based in South Wales that Alistair's continued on after I left, and it's great to have sort of set up something there that has kind of continued after I moved on from Newport. So around the time that I moved to London, we put forward this idea that we would have a collaborative network of researchers in the UK who are researching into PSP that would recruit patients with PSP. And so we put this in as a proposal to the PSP Association. So this was called the Prospect Study, so a prospective study of patients with PSP and corticobasal syndrome. And that started off with 7 study sites that were joining in with the collaborative research. And so those study sites were Brighton, Nigel Lee, Oxford, Michelle Huw, Cambridge, James Rowe, Manchester originally that was Alex Gerhardt, and then that's been taken over now by Chris Koblecki, and Newcastle with David Byrne, which has now been taken over by Nicola Pavesi. So those are the initial 7 sites, and the idea really was we'd run a drug trial for PSP patients, but without a drug treatment. So we'd do the measurements and collect biosamples and track what happened to PSP patients over time, which would really give us the information that we'd need to set up future trials and also establish a network of sites that could assess PSP patients that would enable future drug trials into PSP. So I think setting up that prospect study was a real kind of milestone for me in terms of taking things forward with PSP research. One of the things that the PSP trustees wanted us to do, which we sort of took on board, was to increase the number of sites and also enable people to be involved remotely. So to be able to fill in questionnaires and send in blood samples via their GPs remotely. So that was the cross-sectional part. So that expanded forward, and we expanded the number of study sites. So it's increased actually to 28 study sites in the UK, and to date we have recruited 1,400 participants. And so that's patients with PSP, corticobasal syndrome, controls, and also patients with MSA, because the MSA Trust have joined in with helping for this research in atypical Parkinsonism. So that's, I mean, even just setting up the infrastructure for that, I think has been a significant achievement, which again has been funded by the PSP Association and sort of driven by the enthusiasm of PSP Association staff, volunteers, and also patients and families who got involved with the research. In terms of sort of discoveries that we've made through all of this and steps forward, I think the identification of variation in the tau gene was very important in the late 1990s. I think setting up the collaborative work, the prospect study, was very important. One of the things that we identified in work that was led by Ed Jabari in our group in around 2018, 2019, was looking at all the different various types of PSP. So both the classical type, which is Richardson syndrome, but also PSP Parkinsonism, gait freezing, and actually showing that those conditions are quite common. So actually, when you look at all these various types of PSP, that PSP is probably twice as common as we thought previously. That's one of the things that was really enabled through the network. The second thing really that it enabled was the first really biological treatment study for PSP. So this was the tau antibody study that was led by Biogen, the company. So this was the Passport study. And I have to say, we successfully recruited patients to that study in the UK, and globally the study recruited very quickly. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful in treating PSP, preventing it progressing, but it was extremely successful, I think, in recruiting large numbers of patients and showing that we could mount this type of study in the UK, and that was in part linked into the prospect sort of network that had been set up. The other thing we did, which I think was a step forward in research, was trying to understand why some patients with PSP progress slowly and some people progress quickly. And so we've done a genetic study to look at that and identified that variation close to a gene called LRRK2, LRRK2, affects the rate of progression in PSP. And that's pretty interesting because LRRK2 is a drug target for Parkinson's disease. And it means that these types of therapies might also be relevant to patients with PSP. And I'm delighted to say that Ed Jabari's taken forward that research, looking at the biochemistry of patients with PSP patients in relation to LRRK2. And I hope that this is going to be important in leading to new trials in the future. I think in terms of the outlook for PSP, I think we're going to see more biological treatments for PSP, so things that alter genes and proteins, either with antibodies or with gene therapies. And we've seen some of those studies come through in Alzheimer's disease. We obviously have the first successful studies for Alzheimer's disease that have come through that manipulate amyloid levels. And I think that's very encouraging that they seem to be affecting the progression of PSP. It's very encouraging. They seem to be affecting the progression of Alzheimer's disease, and I think that we'll see similar studies coming through in PSP over the next few years. I think another important thing that's going to come up over the next few years is understanding PSP in different populations. So most of the work that's been done, certainly with respect to genetics and clinical features in PSP, has been in people of European ancestry. And one of the things we're developing through the GP2 program, the Global Parkinson's Genetics Program, is now including PSP patients and trying to understand more about PSP patients in other populations. So in South Asian, East Asian, African populations, understand how this condition affects people in different parts of the world, including, of course, non-European patients in the UK who are affected by PSP. So I think that's going to be a very important part of research over the next few years. I think there are also going to be more biological tests that will enable us to diagnose PSP earlier. I think one of the big barriers to recruiting people for trials in PSP is that there's such a long delay to diagnosis. So in the Prospect study, the average time to diagnosis from the start of symptoms is about 3.5 years. So one of the things we're trying to focus on over the next few years is trying to develop ways of diagnosing PSP much earlier. I think part of that relates to triggering physicians, hospital doctors, when they first see patients referred with Parkinson's or gait disorders, to consider PSP. And also I think in the development of new tests, like biochemical tests looking at tau and tau scans, that will enable us to diagnose PSP much earlier. And actually, we just have some funding now from Medical Research Council, the MRC, to set up a study linked to Prospect, which is called the Express study, which is going to be really focused on early diagnosis. So again, this research that we're doing has been really triggered by the sort of funding that's been given to us by the PSP Association, the support the PSP Association taking us forward.